By the time the
Stop!
first
You can't
motorcycle
go
went
through
down in
there!
the ditch, the
We
mountain
have
was
to
already
hit
on
that.
fire.
You'll be killed!
Not
Please!
somewhere far off, not a faint orange line against the horizon. The fire was here, threaded through the trees, crawling in the grass, riding the wind itself like something alive and hunting. Smoke rolled across the two-lane road so thick that riders 20 feet apart could barely make out each other's taillights, and sparks came screaming through the dark in bright, vicious arcs landing on leather, on chrome, on bare skin, hissing where they struck. 1 second, there were engines roaring and men shouting coordinates that no longer mattered. The next second, a pine tree beside the road detonated from the inside out, superheated sap turning the trunk into a bomb, and half its crown came down in a curtain of flame that lit the asphalt orange and sent 3 bikes swerving hard toward the shoulder. And right in the middle of that road, standing where no sane person should have been standing, was an old woman. She held a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Her white hair was pulled back in a tight knot. Her face was all hard angles and ash carved deep by decades of wind and weather, and something fiercer than both. She wore men's work boots, an old denim jacket with the cuffs rolled twice, and an expression that made it absolutely clear she had stopped being impressed by danger a very long time ago. She didn't wave, she didn't panic, she didn't step aside. She screamed over the fire with a voice that cut through smoke and engine noise like a blade through paper. Kill the engines if you want to live. 57 Hells Angels had been trying to outrun this wildfire for the last 20 minutes. Their main route north was blocked by fallen timber. Their fallback road had already been swallowed by flame. 2 riders had gone down on gravel trying to make a blind turn through smoke, and the rest had bunched up on this stretch of mountain highway between 2 burning ridges with nowhere left to go and the air getting worse by the second. Now they were staring at a woman who looked about 80 years old and weighed less than the saddlebags on most of their bikes. The first instinct in a group like that was never obedience. It was suspicion. Suspicion kept men alive on roads where trust got you buried. A big rider with a gray beard and soot blackened across his face like war paint leaned his bike sideways and yelled through the smoke, "Lady, get off the damn road!" His name was Sully. He'd been riding with this chapter for 19 years. He'd seen bar fights that ended in hospitals, and highway chases that ended in ditches, and funerals where the caskets stayed closed. He was not a man who frightened easily, and he was not a man who took orders from strangers. The old woman raised the shotgun, not at him, at the line of trees behind him. 3 seconds, she said. That crown goes up. This whole stretch becomes an oven. You can argue with me, or you can die stupid. Then the trees behind Sully ignited. Not slowly, not with any kind of warning that a man could process and react to. The top of the ridge behind them flashed orange in one violent pulse, and a deep rushing sound rolled through the timber overhead, and heat hit every rider on that road like the door of a furnace swinging wide. Sully flinched. 2 bikes rocked on their stands. A younger rider cursed and grabbed for his handlebars. A spark rained across his shoulders. She had known, not guessed, not estimated. She had counted 3 seconds, and the mountain had obeyed her clock exactly. That was the first moment any of them understood that the old woman on the road was not crazy, was not lost, was not some frightened grandmother who had wandered out of her house in confusion. She read fire. She read it with the precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning its grammar, its moods, its habits, and she had just proved it in front of 57 men who had no other proof left to trust. "Engines off," she said again. Her voice dropped lower now, still carrying over the crackle and roar, but no longer screaming. She didn't need to scream. She had their attention in full. "You keep revving in this smoke, half of you pass out before you make the next turn. Carbon monoxide doesn't care how tough you are." One by one, then in clusters, then all at once the engines died. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Without the bikes, they could hear the mountain burning. Trees cracking open from the heat, sap popping in sharp little explosions. Wind pushing flame through dry brush with a low, hungry roar that sounded less like weather and more like breathing. Somewhere lower in the valley, something metal blew apart with a boom that rolled up the slope and echoed off the rock faces above. The old woman turned and pointed her lantern toward a break in the ditch. Barely visible through the smoke, a narrow gap opened between scrub oak and black stone. "Off the road, single file, no lights. Stay close. Nobody rides. You push those bikes and you do exactly what I say." Sully stared at her. Who the hell are you? She didn't look back. Dorothy Harlan, and unless one of you boys knows this land better than I do, you'd better start moving. They followed, not because they trusted her, not yet. But fire had a way of stripping men down to the truth, and the truth right now was simple enough to choke on. The road was death. This woman was not. And the gap between those two facts left no room for pride. They dragged the bikes off the asphalt and onto a narrow service track that no map would have shown. It cut behind a wall of scrub oak and dropped into a shallow depression between black rock and dry grass barely wide enough for one machine at a time. More than once the riders lost footing on loose dirt. Handlebars slammed against branches. Boots slipped on gravel that had been baking in radiant heat for hours. Dorothy moved at the front with that lantern held low and steady, never pausing, never looking back for longer than a second. She navigated by memory. Every root, every stone, every bend in the track lived inside her body the same as her own bones. A younger rider coughed so hard he dropped to one knee and had to be hauled up by two others. His name was Jax, broad-shouldered and shaved-headed, and the smoke had gotten into him worse than most because he'd been riding without a face cover when the first wave hit. Wrap your sleeves over your nose, Dorothy barked without slowing. Mut your mouth only, your nose. Breathe shallow, save your lungs. A tattooed rider in his 30s glared through streaming eyes. You a firefighter or something? No, Dorothy said. I'm the woman who stayed when the rest of this county forgot how this mountain burns. The line kept moving. Smoke thickened, thinned, then shifted hard as the wind changed. Above them, the fire ran uphill with terrifying speed. The men couldn't see it clearly anymore, but they could feel it. Heat pulsed through the dark in waves. Ash stuck to sweat. Sparks landed on leather and denim and had to be slapped out in motion. One of the bikes snagged on a root and tipped. 3 men moved to pull it upright, but a cry went up farther back in the line. Jax had gone down again. He was on his side beside the path. One hand clawing at his throat, the other planted flat in the dirt as his chest heaved and produced nothing. His eyes were wide. His lips had started to turn the wrong color. Smoke inhalation, Dorothy said, already kneeling beside him. Get his vest open. Mrs. Sully crouched on the other side. He's done. Dorothy shot him a look so cold it cut clean through the heat around them. He's not done until I say he's done. She shoved her lantern into another man's hands, forced Jax's chin up to open his airway, slapped his cheeks twice with sharp, controlled strikes, then pointed at the biggest rider in the nearest cluster. A man built like a loading dock, shoulders wider than most door frames. You, carry him when he can't walk. You lose him, you answer to me. The big man blinked, stunned at being ordered around on a burning mountain by a woman twice his age who weighed less than one of his arms. Then without a word, he lifted Jax under the shoulders and got him moving. Farther back in the line, a younger rider named Finch was losing his war with his own lungs. Not from smoke, not exactly. The smoke was part of it, but the real enemy was inside his chest. Every breath felt like it was being stolen before it arrived. His hands were shaking. His vision kept narrowing to a tunnel. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the fire, and some part of his brain had decided that the next breath would be the last one that worked. He was 30 years old, heavy through the shoulders, smoke streaks cutting pale lines through the grime on his face where his eyes had watered. He gripped the handlebars of his bike so hard, his knuckles had gone white under the soot, and he kept his head down so nobody could see that the shaking had spread from his hands to his jaw. He didn't know it yet, but Dorothy had already noticed. The track narrowed through a stand of dead manzanita so dry, it sounded like bones snapping when the bike scraped against it. Dorothy moved faster now, glancing into the dark, reading the wind, reading the smoke, reading something in the air that none of the men behind her could name. Then she stopped so suddenly the line nearly collapsed into itself. Everyone froze. Dorothy lifted one hand. At first they heard nothing except the fire. Then the crack of branches above. Then a deeper splintering groan from the canopy, the sound of weight surrendering to gravity. Down, Dorothy said. No one moved fast enough. She spun and screamed it. Down, now! The whole line threw itself flat a split second before a flaming limb, the size of a telephone pole, smashed across the track behind them, showering sparks and cinders over the men and bikes like shrapnel from a bomb. The blast of heat was so fierce several riders covered their faces by instinct and felt it burn through their sleeves. Someone shouted in pain. A saddlebag caught fire. Another rider slapped it out with both hands, cursing steady and low. Jack's half-conscious on the big man's shoulder made a strangled sound from somewhere in the dirt. Dorothy was already up again. "That was your warning," she said. "Next one kills you. Move." A rider with a skull ring spat ash and muttered, "Jesus Christ." "No," Dorothy said, already marching ahead. "Jesus isn't walking you off this ridge. I am." Under any other circumstances, that line would have gotten her laughed at. Maybe worse. Tonight, nobody laughed. Tonight, the only authority left on this mountain was an old woman with a lantern, and every man behind her knew it, even if none of them would have said it out loud. The path finally opened into what had once been a cattle cut, a low, winding strip of bare earth between scrub and rock. The men could breathe a little easier there, though easier meant only that each lungful felt less like swallowing sandpaper. Their boots hit hard ground. Their bikes rolled faster. The air shifted, and for the first time they heard something that did not belong to the fire. Water. Not much. A tank, maybe a pump line. Something man-made, a thin trickling sound underneath the roar. The men looked up. Ahead, through smoke and intermittent flame glow, stood the shadow of a house. Small, old, wood-sided and weather-beaten the way mountain homes get when nobody comes to visit, and the woman who lives there doesn't care. A porch roof slanting low over two rocking chairs. One upstairs window boarded. A rusted windmill behind it turning slow in the hot wind. To the left, a root cellar built into the earth with a heavy plank door. Farther uphill, barely visible, a corrugated storm shelter tucked against black stone. The whole property sat in a natural bowl of cleared land, like the mountain had spared this one patch just long enough for someone to make a stand. Dorothy didn't pause to admire it. She had built this place into a fortress over decades. She knew every board, every beam, every buried line. She had no need to look at it with fresh eyes. "Get them in," she said. Men who had spent years being the most feared thing on most roads found themselves staring at that little house the way survivors stare at shore after a shipwreck. But even then, instinct fought common sense. There were too many of them. The place was too small. An old wood in a wildfire felt more like a coffin than a shelter. Sully grabbed Dorothy's arm. "You expect 57 men to fit in that?" "No," she said. "I expect 57 men to do what they were told before this fire decides for them." She jerked free and started issuing orders with a precision that sounded less like panic management and more like military doctrine refined over decades of solitary practice. "Any man with burns or bad lungs goes to the cellar first. Strongest 10 unload every water container you see around this property. You smell gasoline on yourself, strip the jacket. You see a spark land anywhere near structure, you stop it before it thinks. No smoking, no arguing, no wandering off. If you brought pride with you, leave it outside." That was when Cade Mercer stepped forward. He was the chapter president. Late 50s, thick through the chest, one eye, bloodshot from smoke, road scars visible under soot. He carried himself with the specific gravity of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a man who entered rooms and felt the space rearrange around him. His patch said what his posture already made clear. He was the authority here. He had been the authority on every road, in every room, at every table for the last 15 years. "We're not cramming into holes in the ground because a grandma says so." Dorothy turned to him fully for the first time. The fire behind them lit half her face orange and left the other half in deep shadow. She looked at Cade Mercer the way a woman looks at weather she has already survived. "I buried a husband on this land," she said. "I watched a summer wind turn a canyon into a furnace before you were old enough to shave. I dug that cellar deeper after the county called me crazy. I laid in water lines they told me I'd never need, and I can tell by the way that smoke is folding over the ridge that in less than 10 minutes this yard will be under ember rain." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the ash caught in the creases of her face and the steadiness in her eyes that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with repetition. She had been here before. Not this fire, this moment. "So you can call me grandma's son or ma'am, makes no difference to me. But if you waste another breath challenging me, I will let the fire teach you manners." For a second, nobody in the yard moved. 57 men stood in the smoke and the red light and waited to see which force would hold. The mountain kept burning, the wind kept pushing. The old woman kept looking at the chapter president of a Hells Angels charter with the patience of someone who had already won this argument a long time ago and was just waiting for him to catch up. Cade Mercer looked away first. "Do it," he growled to his brothers, and the yard erupted into motion. Men stumbled and ran. Saddlebags were ripped open. Bottled water med kits, blankets, tools, half-melted packs were thrown onto the porch. Two riders dragged Jax toward the cellar. Another man nearly fell trying to unlatch a warped storm hatch until Dorothy shoved him aside and yanked it open herself, with a strength that defied every assumption they had made about her body. The cellar smelled of dirt, iron, and old wood. Stone walls, deep enough to stand in, cool enough to breathe in, dark enough to feel like the earth had swallowed you for safekeeping. "Down the steps," she ordered. "No bunching. Keep air moving." A rider in fingerless gloves peered into the darkness below. "How the hell were you ready for this?" Dorothy gave a short, humorless sound. "I wasn't ready. I was realistic." Then the first ember storm hit. It came with a roar of wind so sudden every man in the yard looked up at once. The sky above the property went from smoky black to a whirling madness of red and orange ash and sparks spinning in the updraft like the air itself had caught fire. Burning pine needles rained across the roof. The porch began to hiss and spit. Somewhere behind the barn, a pile of old timber caught and flared in one bright, hungry rush. "Move," Dorothy shouted. Men surged toward shelter, some into the root cellar, some toward the storm bunker, some onto the porch, hauling supplies. A few stayed in the yard trying to keep the bikes upright and out of the way, though it was already obvious that most of those machines would never leave this mountain the same way they had come up. And then through the smoke, at the edge of the property came a sound that did not belong. A motorcycle engine, screaming too fast, too high, coming in blind from the burning ridge above. One headlight dead, one saddlebag on fire. The rider leaning so far to one side that it looked less like control and more like a man refusing to fall until gravity gave him no choice. The bike burst through the broken fence line, clipped a post, and skidded across Dorothy Harlan's yard in a shower of dirt and sparks and burning pine needles before slamming sideways and rolling twice. Three men ran for him. "Don't touch the fuel," Dorothy shouted. Too late. Gasoline was already pouring from the torn tank, and a dark ribbon crawling through the dust toward a strip of ember-covered grass beside the porch. The fallen rider tried to rise and collapsed again. His jacket was half burned up the back. One glove was missing. His right forearm was raw and red, where the skin had cooked under radiant heat. He looked up through ash-caked lashes and coughed out one broken sentence. "Road's gone." His name was Brennan. He'd split from the main group at a switchback 20 minutes earlier, tried to find a way around the blockage, and ridden straight into the worst of the Crown fire. He had no idea anyone else was alive. He had come in expecting to die alone and found 57 brothers in a stranger's porch instead. Then the fuel lit. Fire ripped along the spilled gasoline with a fast, ugly hiss. It reached the bike and turned the whole machine into a violent orange bloom that punched heat across the yard and sent men throwing themselves backward. One hit a porch post. Another tripped over a crate of bottled water and went down hard. Dorothy did not move back. She stood at the edge of the heat bloom like a woman standing at a property line. She refused to yield. "Shovel," she barked. "Dirt, not water, dirt." Cade Mercer moved first this time, not because someone told him to, because something in the last 10 minutes had rearranged his understanding of competence, and the woman standing 5 feet from a gasoline fire, shouting the right answer, while everyone else scrambled for the wrong one, had just completed the rearrangement. "You heard her," Cade shouted. "Shovels, smother it." That was the moment the transfer became real. Not Dorothy earning authority. Cade lending his. The chapter president of a Hells Angels charter repeating the orders of an 80-year-old widow in front of every patched rider on the property, and doing it without hesitation, without qualification, without a trace of performance. Two riders tore around the side of the house and came back with flat-grained shovels from nails by the shed. Others dropped to their knees and clawed loose earth by hand. Dirt flew. Sparks snapped. The bike fire died under mounds of packed soil, still smoking and crackling, but no longer spreading. Dorothy was already at Brennan's side. She knelt, cut the sleeve off his burned arm with a knife from her boot, and studied the damage with eyes that had seen worse and remembered all of it. A younger biker watched her work. You carry that thing all the time. I carry what I need. She shouted without looking up. Boil water if there's still pressure in the line. Clean cloth, no greasy rags. Somebody bring me the old green tin from the kitchen shelf. Top shelf, left side next to the flour canister. You come back with the wrong thing, I'll know. A man near the door blinked. Then he ran. Brennan was barely conscious. His beard was singed to patches. Dorothy poured a measured trickle of water over his wrist and forearm, then checked his neck, his eyes, his breathing. Fast, precise, no drama. You hear me, she said. Brennan, stay awake. You pass out on me. I make your friends sing church hymns until you wake up out of pure spite. One of the men nearby gave a short laugh before catching himself. Brennan looked confused, then coughed, then managed the faintest twitch of a smile. Good, Dorothy said. You're still in there. The man returned from the kitchen with the green tin. Dorothy popped it open. Inside salve and gauze. Old but carefully kept. Rolled tight, sealed in wax paper, stored with the same deliberate foresight that had built the cellar and buried the water drums and reinforced every wall on this property against a future that other people refused to believe in. Nothing on this land was random. Dorothy Harlan had been preparing for this night for nearly half a century, and the men around her were only just beginning to understand the scale of it. Cade crouched beside her while she wrapped Brennan's arm. Up close, the chapter president looked rougher than before. Smoke had deepened every line in his face. His shoulders carried the particular tension of a man who had spent the last hour being wrong about everything and was now recalculating fast. How many structures on this property hold weight? He asked. Dorothy finished the bandage and rose. Cellars deep and cool holds maybe 25 before the air turns. Storm shelters stronger but tighter. 15, maybe 18. Houses for short rotation, only treatment and supply. Never permanent shelter. That's only 60 if we pack them. 57 men plus Brennan makes 58. Tight, but it works in layers. He frowned. Layers. Nobody stays in one place all night. Cellar for the worst lungs and worst burns. Storm shelter for the strongest bodies who can tolerate tight heat. House for supply rotation and triage. Yard crews in shifts to kill spot fires before they grow teeth. Water rationed by breath, not by thirst. She turned to face him. We don't put all our lives in one box. One failure doesn't get to kill everyone. Cade studied her for a long moment. That's a real plan. Dorothy stared past him toward the tree line where the glow was getting stronger and the smoke was folding in patterns she did not like. It used to be. Before he could ask what that meant, she was already moving. She crossed the yard and raised her voice loud enough for every man on the property to hear. Listen carefully. If you can still smell gasoline on your clothes, strip the outer layer now. Leather catches and holds heat. Wet cloth on your mouth and nose, not dry, wet. Lighters matches spare fuel containers go in that metal trough by the pump. Not in your pockets, not near the house. She pointed in quick, sharp jabs. You 4 inventory water. You 3 clear the porch and open every path to the cellar. You 2 get that hose line out, even if the pressure fails. You 6 with me around the structures. I want every ember trap identified and killed. A wiry rider with prison tattoos across both knuckles squinted. Ember trap. Places fire likes to hide, Dorothy said, already moving. Under steps, in gutters, dry leaves packed against walls, vents. Corners where men tell themselves they'll check later and then never do. They moved fast around the property. Behind the house, a feed shed was already burning through one wall. Not roaring yet, but chewing inward with steady purpose. The pump handle by the water tank still worked, though the pressure was weak and coughing air. A stack of split fence posts near the barn had begun to smoke at the ends. The windmill base was catching embers in its rusted braces. Dorothy pointed with economy. Tear that stack apart. Drag it into bare dirt. Hose the tank supports. Not the fire. The supports. If the tank drops, we lose water. Then we lose everybody. One rider hesitated near the burning shed. It's too far gone. Dorothy rounded on him fast enough to make him flinch. That shed lights the barn. The barn lights the side yard. Side yard lights the porch. Porch lights the house. The house lights the trees. And then your shelters become ovens. Her voice cut through the crackling dark. Nothing out here is separated. Everything connects. That's how fire thinks, and that's how you need to think if you want to see morning. The rider gritted his teeth and moved. From the root cellar came the sound of coughing and men shifting shoulder to shoulder in too little space. Cade descended 3 steps, checked the occupants, came back up with soot striped across his face. 24 in there now, 2 with bad lungs, 1 with a bad ankle. Brennan makes 25 if we send him down. No, Dorothy said. Brennan stays on the porch for the moment. His lungs can't take cellar air yet. He needs open flow until the worst of the inhalation passes. From the edge of the porch, a thick-necked rider in his 40s stepped forward. His face said he had been holding this in for a while. You keep talking like it's simple. It ain't. We got 58 men, too many bodies, not enough air, not enough room, and a fire that ain't done with us yet. Dorothy looked at him. Now you're thinking. Good. Keep going. He pointed toward the dark beyond the cleared yard. What if this fire circles us? It will. A beat of silence. And what if it crowns? It probably will. He stared at her. Then what's your plan, old lady? Dorothy's eyes hardened, not because of the words, because behind him, the mountain made a deep booming sound, a tree trunk giving way somewhere in the dark, and she did not like what that boom meant about the fire's direction. My plan is layers, she said. Cellar for heat shelter in the worst of the lungs, storm bunker for overflow in the strongest bodies because they can handle tight space. House for short rotation, only never permanent. Yard crews in shifts to kill spot fires before they grow. Water rationed by breath, not by thirst. We do not make one shelter the whole bet. We spread the risk, we stay flexible, and we keep working until the mountain runs out of reasons to kill us. Cade gave a slow nod. That's more than a plan. That's doctrine. Dorothy stared past him toward the trees. It was my husband's idea first. I just never stopped improving it. That was when the fire hit the shed roof in full. The feed shed had been smoldering for minutes, burning slow through one wall. Now the roof caught in a rush of superheated air, and what had been a contained wall fire blew outward through the rafters in a column of flame. Dry feed sacks, old boards, years of settled dust turned the whole structure into a torch that leaned toward the barn with the wind. Dorothy didn't curse. That would have wasted breath. You 6 with me, everyone else stay on assignment. Cade moved with her. So did Sully, the wiry man with the prison tattoos. 2 younger bikers and 1 broad-shouldered rider named Dalton, whose left sleeve had been half burned off in the trail, but who looked too stubborn to acknowledge pain. They rounded the house, and the heat slammed them sideways. Up close, the shed looked less like a building and more like a living thing trying to climb out of its own skin. Rafters glowed orange. The doorway was a square of pure fire. The roof sagged in the middle. 20 feet away, the barn wall was already peppered with sparks, and the old dry grass along the foundation had begun to smoke in 3 separate places. Dorothy pointed in quick, violent jabs. You beat out that grass. You 2 tear down that fence section before it catches and carries. Bucket line here, not at the doorway at the barn wall. We save what spreads, not what's lost. One rider shouted over the roar. There's tools in there. Dorothy wheeled on him. Then bury them tomorrow. Cade grabbed a flat shovel and went to work scraping burning grass back to bare dirt. 2 others kicked apart the fence line, ripping slats loose and hauling them into the open where they couldn't transmit flame. Dalton threw a wet blanket over a smoking patch at the barn corner and stamped it down with both boots. Then the shed roof groaned. Deep, wooden, final. Pack! Dorothy screamed. They leaped away as half the structure collapsed inward, sending a cyclone of sparks 30 feet into the air. A wave of heat punched across the yard so hard one of the younger riders staggered and fell on his hands. Dalton turned a fraction too late and cried out. The side of his neck had taken a spray of burning cinders. Dorothy spun, grabbed him by the jaw, checked the burn with one glance, and shoved him toward the porch. Treatment line, now. I'm fine, he said automatically. You are blistering while you lie to me. Go. He went. For a few terrible seconds, it looked like the shed collapse would send enough fire sideways to ignite the barn roof. Cade and Sully kept scraping and kicking burning grass back to bare soil. Dorothy climbed onto an overturned trough to reach the barn eaves and beat out 3 separate ember nests with the soaked canvas tarp, each strike precise, each movement rationed. A rider near the corner yelled, "Sparks getting under the wall!" "Get lower," Dorothy shouted back. "Fire likes to crawl before it leaps." He dropped to a knee, peered beneath the wall edge, and started clawing out smoking straw and old leaves that had packed under the siding over years of neglect. Another 5 minutes and the whole barn would have lit from underneath. He looked up at Dorothy with something close to disbelief. "How do you see all this?" "I remember what got missed before." Kate heard it. His shovel paused for 1 second. "Before what?" Dorothy hit another ember nest and answered without looking down. The tarp struck the wood. Sparks scattered and died. "Before the Granger fire." The name meant nothing to most of them. To one older rider near the back, it meant enough. He looked over. "That was back in the 70s, wasn't it?" "78. Dorothy said it flat. No wait, no invitation, just a date. "You were there. My husband died there." Nobody spoke. The sentence came out stripped of everything a storyteller would have added. No dramatic pause, no trembling voice, no softening of the eyes. Just a fact that had been living inside this woman for nearly half a century and had long ago stopped being grief and become something else entirely. Something harder, something that looked like preparation. Every buried water drum, every reinforced cellar wall, every habit of checking eaves, checking grass lines, checking dry corners. Every tool hanging in the right place. Every supply cached where panic couldn't misplace it. All of it traced back to that sentence. "My husband died there." Kate looked at Dorothy Harlan differently after that. Not with pity. She would have rejected pity like a bad check. He looked at her with the recognition of a man who understood that the person standing next to him had been in a war longer than his own and had built her entire life around making sure the war never won the same way twice. They saved the barn. Not cleanly, not completely. One wall was scorched black, and the old feed door had warped from heat. But it held. The pump kept working. The water tank stayed upright on its supports because Dorothy had ordered those supports hosed first when every instinct said to aim the water at the flames instead. The wind shifted again. Smoke blew a curtain through the side yard. Then from the porch, someone shouted a name that had not been shouted before on this property. Dorothy. Not lady, not old woman, not grandma. Dorothy. Dorothy. That changed something none of them said out loud, but all of them felt settle into place. She was no longer a curiosity. She was no longer a temporary authority justified only by emergency. She was the reason they were still breathing, and they had started calling her by name because anything less felt like a lie. She turned and ran toward the porch. Brennan was sitting against the wall, eyes glassy, jaw tight with pain. Beside him on the floorboards lay Vaughn. He was on his side, breathing in ragged, high little pulls, each one sounding like it cost more than the last. His right side had taken severe heat, burns bad ones, not fresh and shallow like Brennan's forearm. Deeper, hotter, the kind that cooked through layers before the nerves fully understood what had happened. He clutched at Dorothy's sleeve with trembling fingers. "Don't leave me outside." It was the first plea of that kind any of them had spoken. Not help me, not fix this, not am I going to be okay. Just that raw, simple, naked human terror that comes when a man realizes he cannot save himself and has no guarantee that anyone else will bother. Dorothy put one hand flat on his chest to steady him. "What's your name?" "Vaughn." "You're not outside, Vaughn, you're on my porch." His eyes darted toward the orange flashes beyond the yard. "If you move, people don't leave me. I know how this works. Bad ones get left behind." Dorothy leaned closer until he could focus on nothing but her face, until the fire and the smoke and the sound of the mountain burning became secondary to the voice of one old woman speaking 4 feet from his ear. "Listen carefully. Nobody gets left on this property while I'm standing upright. Not you, not him, not any man here. That's not a promise. That's how I built this place." Vaughn's mouth shook once. He gave the smallest nod. "Good," Dorothy said. "Now hold still and let me work." She treated his burns with the same rationed efficiency she applied to everything else. Measured water, clean cloth, salve from the green tin. Every action calculated against the reserve because waste was just death wearing a generous face. From behind the barn, the fire kept talking. From above the house, the sky kept reddening. The temperature in the yard climbed degree by degree, and every man on the property could feel the change in the air. Something was coming, something bigger than the ember storms, bigger than the shed fire, bigger than anything they had faced so far. Dorothy felt it first. She always did. She stood from Vaughn's side and walked to the edge of the porch. The bowl of cleared land around her house had been her defense for decades. But defense had limits, and limits had schedules, and the schedule was running out. The glow between the trees was no longer scattered. It was solid, a wall, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration of fear. A literal advancing wall of orange-red light moving behind the black trunks of burned pines eating brush, consuming deadfall rising and dropping and breathing as the wind drove it downhill toward the bowl where her house stood. Cade came up beside her. For the first time, his voice carried no steel at all. "How long now?" Dorothy watched the fire the way a sailor watches a wave he knows he cannot outrun. She read the smoke folding over the ridge. She read the color of the air near the ground. She read the speed of the embers and the angle of the wind and the sound, that deep, low rushing sound that meant the crown was feeding and the ground fire was following and the mountain had stopped negotiating. "Less than 5 minutes," she said. Then she looked at the men. At the cellar entrance, where Jax was breathing easier but still fragile. At the storm shelter hatch, where 15 bodies sat shoulder to shoulder in dark heat. At the porch, where Brennan and Vaughn lay wrapped and hurting. At Finch standing near the cellar door with his hands shaking and his jaw locked and his eyes refusing to look toward the tree line. At all of them. Every burned hand, every soot-black face, every set of lungs still working inside a body that had no right to be alive, except that an old woman had decided they would be. Dorothy stepped off the porch. She raised her lantern and pointed through the smoke toward the upper slope. There, barely visible through flame and drifting ash, stood the dark stone shape of the livestock bunker, built half into the hillside. Stone-faced, heavy-doored. The safest structure on the property by a margin that mattered. Between them and it, the whole yard had begun to rain fire. "No more half measures," Dorothy said. Her voice carried across the yard and hit every man standing in it. "From this moment on, anybody outside when I tell them down is already dead." She looked once more at the advancing wall of orange behind the trees. Then she turned back to face the men she had pulled off a burning road less than 2 hours ago and spoken the words that would carry them into the worst part of the night. "We hold together or we don't hold at all. And I have not spent 47 years on this ridge to lose anyone now." The mountain roared, the embers fell, and Dorothy Harlan walked into the firelight to begin the work of keeping 58 men alive through a night the rest of the world had already given up on. The first wave of ember rain came down so thick it turned the yard into a killing floor. Not drifting ash, not stray sparks skipping on the wind. These were sheets of burning material spinning out of the canopy in bright orange constellations, bouncing off the porch, sliding across packed dirt, lodging under eaves, catching in jacket seams, dropping into open collars, bedding down in every crack and corner, where fire could wait 10 quiet seconds and then become catastrophe. Dorothy didn't waste a single one of those seconds. "Cellar line first," she shouted. "Storm shelter takes the next 10. The rest hold by the porch until I place you. Single file. Nobody bunches the steps." Cade was already repeating her orders before the last word left her mouth. His voice carried a different weight now, not the growl of a man defending rank, the bark of a man who had found someone worth amplifying. Men who looked like they would rather fight a room full of armed strangers than take direction from anyone were now shoving each other into formation because the alternative was visible, advancing, and hot enough to cook skin from 30 feet away. Behind the black skeletons of the trees, the main body of the wildfire was rolling downhill, sometimes hidden by smoke, sometimes visible in full as whole brush lines torched and vanished in single breaths. Jax had to be half carried toward the root cellar. Brennan, his arm bandaged and his face still gray with shock, was moved by 2 brothers into the shelter rotation. Vaughn, pale and sweating through his burns, was lifted by 3 men who handled him like something made of paper and nerve endings, because every touch made him flinch, and every flinch made them gentler. One rider with singed eyebrows kept slapping at the back of his vest where embers had burrowed into the stitching. Another stood frozen for a second too long, staring at the tree line like his brain had simply refused to process what his eyes were reporting. Dorothy caught him by the front of the shirt and shoved him toward the storm shelter. You want to admire it? Do it from underground. He stumbled, snapped back to himself, and went. Then the air pressure changed. That was the part none of them were ready for. Before the fire front arrived in full, the mountains seemed to inhale. Wind pulled sideways across the yard, sharp and hot, and confused, as if the atmosphere itself couldn't decide which direction to run. Smoke stopped drifting one way and began spinning in tight, disoriented circles. The old windmill gave a shriek like metal being torn. Somewhere inside the house, a window rattled so hard the glass sang. Inside the root cellar, 26 men sat shoulder to shoulder on crates, steps, and bare dirt floor. Wet cloths tied over their faces, eyes reflecting dim lantern light. The air down there was close enough to chew thick, with the heat of too many bodies, too much fear, and not nearly enough oxygen. That was where Finch broke. He had been holding himself together with his teeth in his fists since the trail. He had pushed his bike through smoke. He had followed orders. He had stayed in line. He had done everything Dorothy asked without complaining, and the whole time the thing inside his chest had been growing, tightening, compressing his lungs into something that felt less like breathing and more like drowning in open air. He made it down 3 cellar steps before his body refused to go further. He turned. He clawed at the door frame. He hauled himself back up into the ember-thick yard and stood there bent double, sucking short, panicked breaths through his teeth, eyes streaming, hands shaking so hard they looked like they belonged to someone else. Dorothy was on him in seconds. "I can't," Finch gasped. "I can't go down there. I can't get air. I can't breathe. I can't." Several heads turned from inside the cellar. Not mocking, something closer to recognition. Men who had done violence, seen prison-broken bones, buried brothers, were looking at one of their own, discovering the simple, humiliating terror of not being able to trust his next breath. Dorothy grabbed a wet rag from a bucket, pressed it over his nose and mouth, and forced him to look at her. Not down at the fire, not up at the sky, at her. "You are not drowning," she said. "Your body thinks you are. Those are not the same thing. 4 counts in, hold 2, 4 counts out. You listen to me, not to panic." He tried, failed, his chest hitched, and his vision narrowed, and for one terrible second, he thought he was going to pass out in front of 57 men who would remember it forever. "Again," Dorothy said. Her hand stayed firm behind his neck, not gripping, anchoring. 4 in, hold, 4 out. You're still here. You're still breathing. Your lungs work. Your fear doesn't get to overrule them." He tried again. This time the breath made it deeper. Not much. Enough. 1 notch down from terror towards something that could survive the next minute. Cade came close. "He's not going to make cellar space." "He doesn't need cellar space right now," Dorothy said. "He needs it well." Finch blinked through wet eyes. Dorothy kept her voice flat and solid. The voice of a woman issuing orders, not comfort. Comfort would have insulted him. Orders gave him somewhere to stand. "You stay by this cellar door. You count men in and out. You watch their eyes. Anyone getting glassy, confused, or too quiet, you tell me. Panic hates purpose, Finch. So I'm giving you one." He stared at her the way a man stares at a hand reaching over a ledge he didn't realize he was standing on. Then he swallowed, straightened half an inch, nodded once. "Good," Dorothy said. "Count." He turned back to the cellar door and started counting. Voices, faces, positions. It wasn't magic. He was still scared, still breathing too hard, still fighting the thing in his chest that wanted to swallow him whole. But now the fear had rails to run on. It had a task. It had a direction that wasn't collapse. Dorothy watched him for 2 seconds. Then she was gone, already moving toward the next problem, because on a night like this, the next problem never waited. Inside the cellar, tempers finally cracked. It had been building. Too many men in too little dark. Too much smoke leaking under the door. Too many bodies generating heat. Too much fear with nowhere to go. The third man who came up the steps demanding extra water set off a chain reaction that had been loaded since the first hour. "He took my bottle," a rider with a cut cheek snapped. "1 swallow," the man beside him shot back. "And you're lying." "Shut up, both of you," Cade growled from the steps. They didn't shut up. That was how scared they were. Fear had burned through the usual hierarchies. A man who would have gone silent at Cade's voice on any normal night was now nose to nose with a brother over 3 inches of water in a plastic bottle. Dorothy stepped between them before either could swing. "Look at me." Silence didn't fall. It was pulled down like a curtain. She took the bottle from the cut-cheek rider's hand, held it up where every man in the cellar could see the remaining water sloshing at the bottom. "This," she said, "is worth more than your pride, your patch, or your opinion for the next few hours." She pointed around the room, slow, deliberate, making eye contact with every face the lantern could reach. Everybody thinks thirst is the enemy because thirst is what you feel. But panic drinks more than mouths do. Panic makes bad breathing. Bad breathing wastes air. Air runs out faster than water in tight ground. So from this moment forward, I ration both. 1 capful per man when I say, not before. Anybody steals water from the injured, I put them outside and let nature do the negotiating. The threat should have sounded absurd. In that cellar packed in heat and dark and the smell of burned leather, it sounded perfectly reasonable. She handed the bottle to Cade. He took it without a word and became the instrument of her rationing. Not his own, hers. And every man in that cellar understood the distinction, even if none of them would have been able to articulate it. Dorothy climbed back out. The yard was worse. The house roof was making sounds no wooden structure should make. Not creaks anymore. Groans. Deep structural complaints from beams that had been holding weight for decades and were now being asked to hold it while the air above them tried to turn into an oven. The gray-bearded Sully looked up at the roofline and said the thing no one wanted to say first. "That roof's going to come through." Dorothy seized the ladder and had it against the porch rail before anyone could argue. She was halfway up when Cade grabbed the side rails and barked for 2 men to lock the base. "Dorothy, get down if it's gone soft," Sully shouted, catching himself on the wrong name, then not correcting it because it didn't matter. Every name felt temporary tonight. Dorothy ignored him. She hauled herself onto the roofline and dropped low on one knee. Heat pulsed up through the shingles. Smoke rolled over the ridge in thick black folds. She disappeared into it for a full 3 seconds, then reappeared farther up, beating down a creeping line of fire with the soaked canvas. "Attic vent took sparks," she shouted down. "Something in there is shifting." Near the chimney flame licked out from under the shingles. Dorothy crawled toward it, ripped a loose shingle free with both hands, and found the problem. An old bird's nest packed with dry material near the vent hole, already glowing at the center. She pulled it free with the hooked metal rod from her belt and flung it off the side. Cade and Sully stomped it dead the instant it hit dirt. Then the roof groaned again. Lower, deeper, inside this time. "Everybody off the main room," Dorothy screamed. Men moved fast. Supplies yanked from the doorway. Brennan dragged farther down the porch. Vaughn and 2 others shifted clear of the front ceiling span. A heartbeat later, something crashed inside the house with a violent burst of dust and sparks. The front window blew outward. One rider ducked too late and took glass across his cheek. "Front room's dead," Dorothy called down. "Nobody under that ceiling again. House is storage only from here, not shelter." When she finally came back down, her hair was full of sparks, and the left sleeve of her denim coat had started to smolder. Sully slapped it out without asking. She gave him one short nod. Nobody called her grandma anymore. Nobody called her old lady. Nobody looked at her like a curiosity or an obstacle or a story they'd tell later over beers. She was the architecture of their survival, and they had started treating her accordingly. Cade met her at the bottom of the ladder. Cellars cooking men slow, shelters choking them faster. Pump pressure is almost gone. We're losing options. Dorothy scanned left toward a black cut in the hillside. An old runoff channel, narrow and ugly and half hidden by scrub, cutting through dirt and stone at an angle that most people would have mistaken for nothing. "The trench route," she said. "There's more water buried on the upper ledge." Cade stared. "You buried more?" "I told you, depends how serious the fire gets." She was already assembling the team. Cade, Sully, the wiry man with the prison tattoos, Dalton, whose neck was wrapped but whose stubbornness outweighed the pain, 2 younger riders with strong lungs. Shovels, hooks, wet cloths, stay low. The trench gives some cover, but Branches will be dropping and smoke pools in the bottom. One man stays rear count. You can't lead every run yourself, Cade said. Dorothy turned on him so sharply he almost took a step back. I am needed where the water is. He held her gaze. Firelight moved in the bloodshot white of his eyes. Then he nodded. Then I go with you. Good. Keep your people from turning brave into stupid. They moved. The trench was little more than a gouge in the earth, an old runoff line cut by decades of snowmelt and rain, half overgrown in places, exposed rock in others. It dipped behind the property's chicken wire enclosure, crossed bare clay, then angled up toward a shallow ledge where the hillside had been cut years ago for buried storage. Dorothy led from the front with the lantern held low and hooded by her palm. Not because she needed much light. She was reading the land by memory. Every root, every turn, every place where the footing changed from dirt to stone lived in her body, the way old songs live in the throat. Cade was behind her. Sully carried one shovel. The wiry rider carried the second. Dalton and the younger men took hooks and extra cloths. The trench narrowed and the heat changed, not cooler, just less direct. The walls cut some of the wind. Smoke drifted through in heavy folds, hugging the low ground. Higher breaths, Dorothy said quietly. Don't bury your face in the bottom air. That's where the carbon pools. Above them, branches came down with ugly snapping sounds. Sparks skated over the trench edge. The wiry rider looked up once and swore under his breath. Whole damn hill's lit. Then stop admiring it, Dorothy said. They found the drums exactly where she had buried them, under a false cover of scrap planks, packed dirt, and old lime sacks gone stiff with age. Only one rusted corner of metal showed through. Sully let out a rough sound halfway between a cough and a laugh. You really did bury the whole damn mountain. Dig, Dorothy said. Shovels bit earth. Hooks tore planks. They uncovered one drum, then a second, then a third, all sealed, all heavy, full of water that had been sitting in that hillside for years waiting for a night exactly like this one. They got two drums loose and started dragging them back on makeshift sling loops. The third stuck hard in packed soil. Dalton and the wiry rider went to lever it free. That was when the hillside above them let go. One sharp crack. Dorothy looked up instantly. Down! A burning branch the thickness of a fence ray came crashing over the trench lip and slammed into the ledge where Dalton had been standing. The impact threw him sideways. Dirt and sparks exploded everywhere. Half the false cover collapsed with the branch along with rock and debris from the brush above. When the dust cleared enough to see, Dalton was pinned from the thigh, down under the branch and a slab of broken plank, flames eating along the bark inches from his leg. He was trying not to scream. Trying and failing. Dorothy dropped beside him. Not all at once, don't crowd him. Cade jammed the hook under the burning branch. It barely shifted. We lift on three, he said. Not straight up, Dorothy corrected. Roll toward me. Dirt first. Smother the flame line. Sully and the wiry rider shoveled the dirt over the burning bark, while the others wedged shoulders under the broken plank. Dorothy braced. What's your name? She demanded, though she already knew. Dalton. Dalton, when I say pull, you drag yourself toward me. Not before. He nodded so hard, it looked like pain alone moved him. 3, 2, 1. Now. They heaved. The branch rolled half an inch and stuck. Dalton screamed. Dorothy shouted again, and they lifted harder. The younger rider nearest the end slipped, recovered, kicked the branch sideways with both boots. This time it moved. Dalton tore his leg free as the gap opened just enough. Cade and Dorothy hauled him bodily into the trench while the bark flared back up behind them. Dorothy ran both hands down his shin and ankle. Burned, bruised, maybe sprained, not broken. You walk ugly, she said, but you walk. He laughed once, wold and thin and on the edge of tears. That's your bedside manner. That's me being encouraging. They got the third drum free after that. Slower. The return down the trench was worse. Every drum took 2 men to drag. Smoke had thickened. Spot fires raced through the grass on either side. Twice they stopped and pressed against the trench wall while burning debris skidded across the lip overhead. Halfway back, Cade spoke without turning his head. You still haven't told me why you stayed. Dorothy kept moving. I did. No, you told me your husband died. That explains grief. Not staying. The men behind them listened without seeming to. In a fire, silence has ears. Dorothy stepped over a root, dragged the sling forward, and said, "Because everybody else wanted this land to become a warning." What's that mean? It means when people are afraid of a place, they like it empty. Makes the story cleaner. Man dies in a fire. Widow leaves. Mountain wins. County forgets. She paused, not from exhaustion, from the weight of what came next. I didn't like the ending. When they came back into the yard hauling the drums, men on the porch stared. Finch at the cellar door blinked like the smoke was making him hallucinate. Brennan, pale and hurting, looked at the mud-caked water drums and said, "You went back out for that." Dorothy set down the sling. "What did you think survival ran on? The drums changed the property at once. Not enough to make anyone safe. Enough to buy time. Enough to cool claws, fill cups, treat burns, and keep ember traps from turning into structure fires every 5 minutes. Cade put 3 men on measured distribution. No one argued. Even the way they handled the water had changed. Careful now, controlled, almost ceremonial. Then Sully did a head count. He did it twice, 3 times. His expression changed with each count, growing darker, harder, until he turned toward the trench with a look that Math had already answered, but his mouth didn't want to confirm. "Where's Kip?" Nobody answered, because nobody had seen him since the trench. The younger rider, who had been rear count, looked up first, confused, then horrified. "He was behind me, coming out." Sully's voice dropped. "He was right behind me." Cade turned slowly toward the smoke-black cut in the hillside. The trench lay there half hidden in ember drift, dark and narrow, and suddenly much longer than it had been an hour ago. Dorothy listened, not to the men, to the mountain, trying to find one human sound inside the roar of a world on fire. For one awful second, there was nothing. Then from somewhere up the trench, a voice tore through the smoke, not loud, not strong, just human enough to be unmistakable. "Help!" Every man in the yard snapped toward it. Cade was already moving when Dorothy caught his sleeve. "Not all of you. He's alive. For the next minute, maybe. If 6 men charge blind into that cut, I lose 7 instead of 1. The words hit like a slap because they were true. She pointed fast. You and you with me. Sully, take yard command. Nobody leaves assigned positions. Keep the water ration moving. Keep the cellar door rotation steady." Sully nodded once. No argument. They went back into the trench. Cade carried a hook. One younger rider took a shovel. The wiry man pulled his cloth tighter across his face. Dorothy took the lantern and went first, because she always went first, because she knew this ground and she knew this fire, and she was not going to let either one of them take a man she had already counted among the living. Kip's second cry came weaker, strangled by smoke. By the time they reached the bend, they could see what had happened. In the confusion after the branch collapse, a section of the trench lip had sloughed off behind the group's rear position. Dirt, scrub, and half-burning debris had come down and caught Kip sideways against the wall. His lower body was buried almost to the waist. One arm was pinned beneath a broken root. Fire was not on him yet, but it was close enough that the air around him shimmered. Dorothy dropped to one knee. "Dig from the legs first, not the chest. If that wall goes again, I want him free low." Kip's face was nearly black with soot, except where tears had cut pale lines through it. He tried to speak, coughed, managed 2 words. "Thought you left." Dorothy shoved the lantern into Cade's hand and started clawing dirt with both hands. "I said nobody gets left on my property." Something happened to Kip's face when she said it. Not calm, not relief, anchor, like a line thrown to a man in deep water. Not pulling him to shore yet, but giving him something to hold that was not the current. They dug fast, low, ugly. No finesse. Just work. Dirt under fingernails, burning grit, and eyes, lungs scraping. The wiry rider got the shovel under the root, trapping Kip's arm, and levered upward, while Cade hauled brush clear. Dorothy braced one boot against the trench wall and pulled at Kip's shoulder. "Can you feel your legs?" "Yeah, both, I think." "Good. When this comes free, you stand immediately. No drama." He tried to laugh and only coughed harder. The wall shifted above them. Dirt trickled down. All 4 looked up. "Now," Dorothy snapped. Cade heaved. The younger rider tore the roots sideways. Dorothy dragged Kip out by the jacket front, just as another chunk of trench lip collapsed where his hips had been. Burning brush dropped into the hole half a second later. They stumbled back together. Kip got one foot under him, then the other. His left knee buckled, but he stayed vertical because fear can keep a man upright longer than pride ever could. When they broke out into the open yard, several men on the porch shouted, not panic, relief. Men who had known each other for years and men who had met 6 hours earlier all reacted the same way, like one body seeing a limb return before the bleeding got worse. Sully got Kip by the shoulders. You ugly bastard. Kip half laughed, half choked. Thought you were uglier. Save it, Dorothy said. He gets checked, then he drinks one cap only. As the yard settled back into its desperate rhythm, a shape appeared from inside the barn. At first, the men nearest the porch thought it was a shadow. Then it moved. A rider burned staggering half black, with soot one sleeve gone, beard singed almost to the skin. Party. He had been inside the barn when the shed collapsed, sheltering behind the stone foundation wall, and no one had tracked him because the night was devouring names faster than anyone could count them. He came toward Dorothy, carrying something clutched against his chest under his jacket. His eyes were wild, unfocused, but he was upright by pure refusal. Barn floor split when the heat hit, he rasped. Saw this under the boards. Didn't know what it was. Knew it mattered, so I went back. He pulled the object from under his jacket. A small metal box. Smoke darkened. Old steel with corners worn smooth by years of being handled before being hidden. One side dented from the fall. Dorothy stopped. For the first time that night, the men around her saw her control shift. Not break, not shatter. Shift. Like a wall that absorbed a blow and held but showed for one fraction of a second the outline of the force that had struck it. Her thumb moved once across the scorched lid, making sure it was real. Cade saw it. What is it? Something that should have burned a long time ago. She did not open it. She stood holding that box with both hands for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, every man watching understood that whatever was inside weighed more than steel and paper. Then she turned to Brennan, who was closest, and put the box into his good hand. Hold this. If you drop it, I resurrect you just to kill you properly. Brennan, shocked into perfect care, clutched it against his chest. Dorothy was already moving again. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking about that box meant remembering, and remembering was a luxury the mountain would not allow tonight. The ember rain thickened. The sky had turned the color of a forged door. And then from beyond the burned tree line west of the property, a sound came that did not belong to any of them. A scream, human, thin, farther out than any of Dorothy's people should have been. The chapter president heard it too. He turned toward the dark. Who's missing? Voices in the yard overlapped, counting, names thrown sharp and fast. Dorothy didn't wait for the answer. She took one step away from the porch toward the sound. Cade grabbed for her arm. No! She tore free. There's someone out there. We don't even know if it's ours. Dorothy's face in the firelight looked older than it had at the start of the night and harder than any of them. That has never been my first question. She took the lantern and moved toward the ravine. Cade swore once grabbed a hook and pointed at the wiry rider and Kip, who had no business going anywhere but who was already standing because the woman who had pulled him out of buried dirt was heading back into the fire and he could not stay behind. Dalton, leg-wrapped and limping, fell in without being asked. You don't have to prove anything, Cade muttered to him. Dalton coughed something black and said, didn't come this far to sit on a porch. The run from the yard to the ravine edge was worse than anything since the trail. Ground uneven, littered with half-burned brush, hidden roots, blackened rocks holding heat like iron. Twice Kip nearly went down when ash-covered holes opened beneath his boots. Dalton's limp got uglier with every step. When they reached Dorothy, she was kneeling beside a man in yellow firefighting gear, half buried under a tangle of burned limbs near the ravine lip. Not a biker, a firefighter. His helmet was knocked away. One side of his face was blistered red under soot. He was conscious, but barely. 10 feet farther down the slope, another yellow-coated figure lay twisted near a burned stump. Cade stared. You came back out here for firefighters. Dorothy didn't look up. I came back for voices. Start lifting. That ended the question. They dropped beside here. The pinned firefighter tried to speak and got a mouthful of smoke for the effort. Dorothy said, don't, save it. His name was Holt. He and his partner Whelan had been running a reconnaissance line along the West Ridge when the fire overran their position. Radio contact was lost. Their escape route was cut. They'd been pinned for nearly an hour, breathing through turnout coats while the world above them burned. The limb-trapping Holt was wedged hard against a rock lip. Cade and Dalton tried to lever it. Nothing. Kip got the hook under one side. The wiry rider tore brush from around Holt's legs. Dorothy slid her arm into the gap and checked along his ribs shoulder neck. Still breathing well enough? Left arm might be broken. Chest is taking weight. He needs out now. Holt forced out two words. Tommy, down. He meant Whelan below them on the slope. He can wait 10 seconds, Dorothy said. You can't. They heaved on three. Nothing. Again. The trunk shifted half an inch with a grinding sound. Holt screamed. Again. All 5 men and one 80-year-old woman put everything they had left into it. The trunk rolled just enough for Dorothy to yank Holt clear by the back of his coat while Kip dragged his lower body free. Then Dorothy was already moving downslope toward Whelan. The ground gave way under her right boot. She went down hard onto one knee, then one hand skidding toward the drop. Kip lunged and caught the back of her jacket. For one instant, every man there saw how old she actually was. Not weak, never that, but human. Thin under the work coat, lungs laboring, hands trembling for the first time all night. Then the moment passed. She tore free, found her footing, and kept going. Whelan was trapped face down, a broken branch pinning his turnout coat into the ground, one leg in a patch of brush that was beginning to smoke again. Every breath he took sounded wet and wrong. Dorothy sliced the turnout coat at the shoulder seam, beside the waist, working the blade with steady precision while the men pulled pinned fabric free in sections, and Cade lifted Whelan's chest by inches so the cloth wouldn't drag him back down. Then a burning stump near the ravine edge let go. It tipped, rolled, and came crashing toward them. Cade shoved Whelan sideways. Dorothy took the full force of the last pull, dragging Whelan by both shoulder straps across the slope. The stump smashed past where he'd been pinned, clipped Cade in the hip, and exploded against a rock below. Dorothy hit the dirt flat, still holding the straps. For 2 beats, she didn't move. Cade rolled toward her. Dorothy! She coughed, once sucked smoke, coughed again, then shoved herself onto an elbow. I'm not dead. Pick him up. Between the 6 of them, they got both firefighters moving uphill. The first carried between Kip and Dalton. Whelan dragged and lifted in ugly stages by Dorothy, Cade, and the wiry rider. Halfway up, Holt's eyes focused on Dorothy through the soot and the blood and the ruined night. Something cut through his pain. Something that looked like recognition. No way, he whispered. Dorothy didn't respond. I know you. He coughed, winced, forced the words out. County training hall, years ago, disaster volunteer seminar. They brought in survivors from older fires to talk about common mistakes. Dorothy kept climbing. You were the woman from the Granger fire. His voice cracked. They said you pulled 3 kids and a deputy out of a burned school bus after the Canyon Road collapsed. Said you stayed in the fire zone after everybody else pulled back. Nobody in the group made a sound. Kip stared. Dalton stopped me limping for half a second. Even the wiry rider turned his head. Dorothy's face closed. It was a long time ago. Holt gave a weak, disbelieving laugh that turned into a groan of pain. I thought they were exaggerating. They forgot the deputy, Dorothy said, and kept walking. Whelan's radio crackled as they crested the slope. Static first, then a burst of broken voice. Unit 4, respond. Anybody on West Ridge? Whelan tried to answer and only coughed blood-flecked spit into his sleeve. Dorothy snatched the radio mic and pressed the transmit button. Her voice, when she spoke into it, was low and steady and hard enough to cut stone. This is Dorothy Harlan on the Harlan property, West Ridge. I have 2 county volunteers alive and multiple civilians sheltered uphill. Repeat, alive. Static answered. Then a broken fragment of reply. Something about All Souls, something about Ridge presumed, then nothing. They think we're dead, Kip said quietly. Nobody contradicted him. Back at the property, Dorothy ordered the final move. Every man out of the cellar, out of the storm shelter, out of the house, all of them heading uphill to the livestock bunker. The stone-faced structure, half sunk into the hillside. The safest place on the mountain. Injured first, strongest bodies on the outside of the line. Nobody runs ahead. Nobody stops unless I say stop. If you fall, the man behind you picks you up. You do not lie down on open ground. You take what water you can carry and nothing that slows your hands. Men started moving before she finished. That alone would have been impossible 2 hours earlier. Brennan tried to stand one-handed. 2 riders helped him. Vaughn whispered, "Don't leave me outside." And this time 3 men answered at once. "We got you." Jax could walk now, barely, with a wet rag over his face and one arm over Kip's shoulder. Finch left the cellar door without being told and started bringing confused men up one by one, talking hard and steady, so they'd follow his voice instead of the panic in their own heads. Dorothy led from the front. Cade and Sully took the flanks. The firefighters were carried in the middle. The run was not a run. It was a brutal, stumbling, disciplined push through open ground under ember drift and crosswind, uphill over dirt already hot through boot soles. "Keep low," Dorothy shouted. "Close it up," Cade roared. A branch came down and clipped a rider on the shoulder. He spun, nearly went down, got grabbed, kept moving. Vaughn cried out when his carriers hit a rut, but they did not stop. Brennan clutched the metal box under his arm and drove on. Dalton's limp got worse by the step, but he stayed in rhythm. Halfway to the bunker, Finch saw one of the cellar men faltering, turning sideways, disoriented by smoke. He slammed into the man, shoulder first, corrected his direction, shoved him forward. The gap didn't open. The line held. The bunker door opened to cool, dark air that breathed out like another world. They went in layers. Injured first, then middle, then rear cover. Sully and 2 others yanked the heavy door wide. Dorothy counted every man through. Vaughn, Brennan with the box, Jax, Kip, Finch, Dalton, the firefighters, the wiry rider, every burned, coughing, limping body accounted for. Cade held the door as the last men entered. "Count," he yelled. Voices in the dark started throwing numbers. Dorothy turned once to look back toward the house. Through smoke and new flame, it was still standing. Still stubborn. Porch roof glowing at the corner. Windmill behind it like a skeletal witness. The property looked less like land and more like memory already being converted to ash. Then the bunker door closed and the counting finished, and every number matched, and Dorothy Harlan stood in the dark, surrounded by men who were alive because she had decided they would be. Inside the bunker, the dark settled like something with weight. Stone walls, low beams, old feed racks, and winter storage hooks. Cramped for 58 men and 2 firefighters, but survivable. Much more survivable than anything outside. In the dimness, voices started. Not the survival talk, not the logistics. Something quieter. Rigby spoke first. A young rider with a scar through one eyebrow. His voice was too rough for his age and too soft for what he was about to say. "I got a girl in Tucson, 7 years old. Last time I saw her, she had a backpack about all bigger than her whole body, and she cried because she thought school buses were monsters." Nobody answered for a moment. Then Vaughn, drifting through pain, opened one eye. "You got pictures?" "Used to." "Used to means no." Rigby stared at the dirt between his boots. "Her mother threw most of them out." Another rider farther back. "Mine's 12, haven't seen him in 3 birthdays." Dalton gave a dry, crooked smile from where he sat with his bad legs stretched out. "Show off." The man snorted, once coughed. "Kid won't even know my voice." Sully asked, "Name?" Rigby looked up. "Ellie." The name moved through the bunker the way small, true things move through dark places. Quietly, without announcement, but touching everything it passed. Then the fire outside changed pitch. Every head lifted. Not louder, different. The low mutter beyond the stone walls sharpened into a rushing, pressurized sound, like a furnace door opening somewhere just out of sight. Dorothy was already standing. The last burn over. Cade rose despite the pain in his hip. "You sure, The first front stripped fuel, the second chased what was left. This one eats what survived both. What do we do? Same thing we've done all night. Low, tight, quiet, wet cloths on every face. Nobody opens that door unless the stone itself starts to fail." The bunker moved as one body. Men shifted down. Cloths were wetted. The firefighters were braced. Vaughn clenched his jaw as Sully helped angle him away from the draft cracks. Dalton pulled his bad leg in closer. Kip put one hand flat on the earth floor like he could feel the mountain thinking through stone. Then the first impact hit. Something large and burning struck the berm above and rolled. Dust sifted from the beams. A second hit. A third. Heat pressed at the cracks around the doorframe in a dry, vicious wave. The air tightened until breathing became something each man had to choose to do rather than trust his body to manage. Rigby shut his eyes and whispered, "Ellie." Finch counted breaths. His own, then others. Then he lost track and started over. The counting still helped. The purpose still held. Dorothy stood near the door with one hand on the radio and one hand on the metal box that Brennan had passed back to her in the dark. She held both objects the same way, with the grip of a woman who had decided that neither the past nor the living would be surrendered tonight. The world outside became the one continuous roaring wall. Every line of light around the door went pure orange. The bunker shook. Heat pushed through stone in waves. Men breathed through their teeth. Some prayed, some cursed. Some did both simultaneously and found no contradiction. Then, as brutally as it had arrived, the worst of it broke. The roar fragmented into separate crashes, then into scattered brush runs, then into the ugly crackle of a mountain still burning, but no longer unified in its hunger. Dorothy listened for a long time after the men around her had started to hope. She listened the way she always listened, not for silence, for the specific quality of sound that meant the fire had finished its argument and moved on to easier ground. Then she nodded once. That was the last full run. The words moved through the bunker like water through cracked earth. Men didn't cheer, they exhaled. Some bowed their heads. One rider laughed in disbelief and coughed so hard Finch had to steady him. Whelan opened his eyes, saw Dorothy still standing, and stopped fighting his pain long enough to understand that he would see another morning. Sully muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." "No," Dorothy said, "just delayed." When she opened the bunker door, morning was waiting. Not sunrise in any beautiful sense, just light thin and gray and dirty, filtering through smoke over a landscape that looked half erased. The ridge was black. Trees stood as burned skeletons. Fence lines were broken or gone. The yard below was a scar of churned dirt and glowing debris. Dorothy's house still stood. One porch corner burned through, roof blistered and sagging, but standing. The windmill remained upright, twisted, and blackened like a survivor, too stubborn to fall. Men came out slowly, blinking into the dead light. The hellsangels who had entered this mountain loud and armored and untouchable now emerged limping, wrapped in cloth, carrying one another by instinct rather than instruction. By mid-morning, the first rescue crews reached the ridge. They came up slow, expecting bodies. Instead, they found Dorothy Harlan standing in the yard with soot on her face, 58 bikers alive. Round her, 2 county firefighters breathing, in a property that looked as if it had personally fought the wildfire and refused to lose cleanly. The lead responder stopped dead. Behind him, another man lowered his radio and simply stared. One of the younger bikers, too exhausted to stand straight, gave a cracked grin through split lips. "You boys look disappointed." Nobody laughed except Sully, and even that came out as a cough. Then county officials arrived, and the first thing one of them asked was not how many people Dorothy had saved, or how she had done it, or whether anyone needed additional medical care. He asked whether this property had been properly registered for emergency shelter use. Cade turned so slowly it scared even his own men. Dorothy only looked at the official for a long second. Ash drifted between them in the morning light. "Son," she said, "if I had waited for your paperwork, you'd be counting corpses." For 2 days after the fire, the mountain smelled like wet ash, melted plastic, and the particular chemical bitterness of things that were never meant to burn, but had burned anyway. Insulation, wiring, rubber hoses, old paint. The smell worked its way into everything. Clothes, hair, wood grain, the water itself. You could not wash it out. You could not walk away from it. You breathed it in, and it became part of you the same way grief becomes part of a person who has carried it long enough to stop noticing its weight. Dorothy stayed on the property. That alone offended people. Not the men who had survived there, not the firefighters, not the exhausted rescue crews who had walked the ridge and seen what she had done with almost nothing and understood in the way that only people who have worked inside disaster can understand that the woman standing in that black yard was not lucky. She was prepared. She was experienced. And she was still standing because she had refused with every tool and every decision and every buried drum of water to let the mountain take anyone else from her. Those people looked at the scorched house, the burned porch corner, the half-wrecked barn, the blackened windmill still turning slow in the last of the hot wind, and they saw endurance. They saw decades of solitary labor transformed into survival. They saw a woman who had turned loss into architecture. But the town looked at Dorothy Harlan and saw a problem that had failed to solve itself. By the third morning, rumors moved faster than truth. Some said she had hidden bikers illegally and interfered with evacuation protocol. Some said the Hells Angels were exaggerating, turning a bad fire into outlaw mythology, because that was what men like that did. Others claimed the firefighters would have survived on their own, that the bunker story was overblown, that old Dorothy Harlan had simply gotten lucky, and now people were romanticizing stubbornness into heroism. Dorothy heard all of it through the mouths of others and answered none of it. She had never been interested in what people said about her. She was interested in what the porch looked like, and right now the porch looked like it needed boards. She patched what she could, nailed temporary planks where the corner had burned through, covered the split roof section with tarps from the winter storage shed, checked the trench, checked the bunker, checked the remaining water drums, noting levels, noting damage, noting what would need replacing before the next fire season, because there was always a next fire season, and the mountain never forgot, and neither did she. Grief damage, pain. She processed them the same way she processed everything else, with a list in both hands. On the fourth day the county came. 2 white trucks with clean tires pulled up the access road and stopped at the edge of the yard. The lead man stepped out first. He introduced himself as Deputy Assessor Martin Pratt, though the way he stood at the perimeter of the property studying the burned ground with the particular distaste of a man who considered ash beneath his shoes a personal insult, told Dorothy everything his name did not. With him came a woman from emergency management who carried a clipboard and an expression of practiced neutrality. Behind her, a man named Loomis from county planning. He was quieter than the others. He didn't look at the damage the way Pratt did with bureaucratic disapproval. He looked at the land, the road line below, the utility corridor to the east, the burned tree cut, the cleared flat beyond the ridge where development could spread if the right obstacles were removed. Dorothy saw him see it. She had been watching men look at her ridge that way for 15 years. Pratt cleared his throat. Mrs. Harlan, given the extent of the structural damage, this site may need to be condemned, pending full safety review. Dorothy kept hammering a board into the porch frame. The sound of the nail going in was sharper than anything Pratt had said. Then review it. Pratt opened a folder. There are also questions about unauthorized sheltering activity during the emergency. Dorothy drove in another nail. You mean the part where people lived? The emergency management woman shifted her weight. Loomis said nothing. He was still studying the road, the ridge, the angles, measuring, imagining. His mind was already 10 years ahead, and what he saw there had nothing to do with an old woman's house. Pratt tried a different approach. The softer voice, the voice men used when they wanted something to sound reasonable that was not reasonable at all. If the property is deemed structurally compromised and emergency access inadequate, the county may be forced to recommend acquisition under Hazard Mitigation Authority. Dorothy stopped hammering. Very slowly she turned. Acquisition. Pratt didn't quite meet her eyes. In cases like this, it can be the most practical outcome. For who? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The silence answered for them the way silence always does, when the people holding the paperwork know exactly what they are doing and are counting on the person across from them to be too tired, too old, or too alone to fight it. Dorothy looked from Pratt to Loomis, to the woman with the clipboard, to the white trucks with their clean tires. Then she set the hammer down on the porch rail with a gentleness that was more frightening than any blow. You've been here before, she said. Not a question. Pratt blinked. Excuse me? This land, this conversation, you've tried 3 times. Road widening, utility easement, scenic access pull-off. Each time the offer got a little lower and the language got a little more official. She looked at Loomis. And each time that man looked at my ridge the same way he's looking at it now. Loomis had the grace to look away. Pratt did not. Those were separate administrative matters. They were the same question in different clothes. And the answer was the same every time. No. Pratt closed the folder and opened it again. Closed it. Then he pulled out a second document, and the temperature of the conversation dropped by 20 degrees. Under emergency authority, the county is also issuing a temporary restriction order on the property. No construction, no structural modification, no occupancy beyond emergency assessment until the review is complete. Dorothy stared at the paper in his hand. You're telling me I can't fix my own house? I'm telling you the county requires a safety determination before any work proceeds. And while you determine the house keeps falling apart, Pratt said nothing. And when it falls apart enough, you condemn it. Pratt said nothing. And when it's condemned, you acquire it. Pratt put the restriction order on the porch rail beside her hammer. The process is standard, Mrs. Harlan. Dorothy looked at the paper, at the hammer beside it, at the board she had been nailing into her own porch on her own land, where she had buried a husband and survived 2 fires and kept 58 men alive through a night the rest of the world had given up on. Get off my property, she said. They left, slowly, officially, with the kind of retreat that isn't really retreat because the paperwork stays behind, and the paperwork is the weapon, and everyone involved knows it. Dorothy stood on the porch for a long time till the white trucks disappeared down the access road. The restriction order sat on the rail beside her hammer. She did not touch either one. That evening she sat on the steps and drank coffee that tasted of smoke because everything tasted of smoke now, and probably would for months. The repaired section of porch behind her had 3 new boards that she was no longer legally permitted to add to. The tarps on the roof flapped in a wind that still carried ash. The yard was black. The barn was scarred. The windmill turned slow and damaged against a sky the color of old bruises. She was alone, not the kind of alone that comes from living in a remote place. She had been that kind of alone for decades and had made peace with it the way you make peace with weather. This was a different kind. This was the alone of a woman who had saved 60 lives and been answered with paperwork. The alone of being too old and too tired and too far from anything that resembled help to do what needed doing next. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Pardee had pulled it from the barn floor, she opened the metal box. The oilcloth inside had gone stiff with age. She unwrapped it carefully the way you handle something that has been waiting a long time to be seen again. Old letters, 2 worn club patches from an era when motorcycle clubs rode roads that didn't have names yet, a silver cigarette lighter blackened by time, and a photograph. 3 young men in work jackets standing beside 2 motorcycles, all chrome and heavy lines and the particular beauty of machines built before anyone decided motorcycles needed to be comfortable. One of the men was Earl Harlan, younger than Dorothy had ever seen herself even in memory, broad-shouldered, smiling in the rare, careless way of a man who still believed the world might play fair if you played it honest. Beside him stood 2 patched riders, different club, different road, same cloth. On the back of the photograph in faded ink that had survived fire and time, and the particular cruelty of being buried and forgotten, was written one line: paid in blood, returned in loyalty. Dorothy held the photograph for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried for Earl Harlan in 1978, and in 1979, and in 1980, and then she had stopped, because crying did not fix the cellar, and crying did not bury the water drums, and crying did not keep the next fire from coming. But she held the photograph, and her thumb moved once across the face of a man who had been dead for nearly half a century, but whose choice on an icy bridge one winter night had set in motion a chain of loyalty that was still even now, even in this kitchen, that smelled of smoke and loss not finished. She closed the box, set it on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, and she went to bed in a house she was no longer allowed to repair on land that men with clean tires and folders wanted to take, carrying a tiredness that went deeper than muscles and bones. The next afternoon, a borrowed pickup truck came grinding up the access road. The engine sounded like it had opinions about the grade. The suspension sounded like it had given up expressing them. Cade Mercer climbed out, moving slower than he had on the mountain. The hip he'd taken against the burning stump in the ravine was making itself known in every step. His face was cleaned up, but not healed. Smoke damage showed in the red around his eyes and the rough edge of his breathing. He wore a different jacket than the one that had been half melted on the ridge, but the patches were the same. Dorothy was sitting on the porch steps. She handed him the second cup of coffee without asking why he was there. She had learned a long time ago that men like Cade Mercer did not explain themselves in advance. They showed up, they sat down, and eventually the reason arrived on its own schedule. He took the cup, lowered himself onto the step beside her with a grunt that told the tree his expression would not, and looked over the yard. The black dirt, the scarred barn, the restriction order still sitting on the rail where Pratt had left it. They came, he said, not a question. Yes. What did they want? My grave while I'm still upright. He gave a short, grim smile. Sounds like county work. Dorothy nodded toward the kitchen where the packet of documents sat unopened on the table. Hazard mitigation, safety review, acquisition, and a restriction order that says I can't touch my own house until they decide whether to take it. His face changed at the last part. The smile left. Something harder moved in behind his eyes. There it is. You expected this. I expected smaller men to show up once bigger flames were done. She took a drink of the coffee. It was bitter and ashy, and it was hers. They've wanted this ridge for 15 years. 3 offers, each one lower than the last. Road widening utility corridor, scenic pull-off. I said no every time. Now the house is burned, and they've got emergency authority and a restriction order and a planner named Loomis who's been measuring my land with his eyes since before the fire went out. Cade sat with that for a moment. You won't win polite against people like that. Dorothy's voice stayed flat. I never counted on polite. He studied her profile, the hard lines. The ash that had settled into the creases of her face and wouldn't fully wash out for weeks. The hands that had pulled men from burning ground and were now holding a coffee cup with the same steady grip. Good, he said. She looked over. You planning something? He stood. The hip made him slow, but it didn't make him careful. He looked down at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude, not pity. Something more dangerous than both. Not me, he said. Us. Before she could ask what that meant, a sound rolled up from the highway below. Faint at first the way weather sounds faint before it arrives. Not one engine. Many. Too far to count, too steady to ignore. Dorothy set her coffee down on the step and rose. The sound grew. Low, then layered, then unmistakable. Motorcycles, more than 57, more than 100, more than any number that a single chapter run could explain. The sound filled the valley the way water fills a canyon rising from the bottom up, finding every gap and hollow and open space until there was no room left for anything else. Cade looked toward the burned tree line below the ridge, where the first glints of chrome were catching the late afternoon light, and said almost under his breath, word traveled faster than I thought. Then the whole valley began to rumble. The rumble grew until the porch boards vibrated under Dorothy's boots. It sounded like weather first, then like machinery, then like something older than both, something that belonged to the deep hum of the earth itself, the sound a mountain makes when it remembers that people once meant something on its roads. The first riders appeared through the haze in a line of chrome and black frames. Then 10 became 50. 50 became 200. Then the highway below disappeared entirely, swallowed by a river of motorcycles pouring into the valley from both directions. Headlights, steel, patched leather, cargo trailers and flatbeds and pickup escorts, and row after row after row of riders climbing the burned corridor toward the ridge like a tide that had been waiting for the right shore. The sound hit the mountain face and came back doubled. A rolling thunder so enormous it made the broken windmill tremble on its rusted base. Men were coming from everywhere. Different cuts, different chapters, different states. Some older, some young, some scarred like old roads, and some riding machines, so polished they looked untouched by the world. But they all came the same way. Steady, deliberate, not reckless, not performing. This was not a parade. It was an answer. Rescue crews still working the lower roads stopped and stared. County deputies near the temporary barricades stepped back instinctively as the line kept growing. Townspeople who had come only to watch the fire aftermath began climbing onto truck beds and fence rails just to see over the smoke, in the dust, and the sheer volume of what was coming. And still more came. Dorothy stood in the blackened yard without moving. For the first time since the fire began, she looked genuinely struck. Not frightened, not confused. Struck in the way a woman is struck when something she has been carrying alone for decades suddenly becomes visible to the world at a scale she never imagined and never asked for. Her eyes tracked the road, the valley, the endless procession still climbing into view, the chrome catching light, the engine settling into that low, patient idle that meant men had arrived somewhere and intended to stay. Cade spoke beside it. Told you it wasn't over. The lead bikes turned off the highway and rolled up the access road toward her property. Not charging, not revving for show. Coming in with the solemn precision of men arriving somewhere that mattered. When they reached the yard, engines began to die. One by one at first, then in clusters, then in long rippling rows that turned the thunder into ticking metal, drifting silence and boots hitting dirt. Riders took off helmets. That was what made it real. Hard faces, tired faces, young faces, white hair, tattoos, old road scars, eyes red from miles of riding into wind and maybe more than wind. Some of them had known the men Dorothy saved. Some had only heard the story secondhand. Some had ridden through the night because somebody somewhere had said an old woman on a burned ridge had opened her door when death was faster than rescue, and that sentence alone had been enough to put them on the road. The first man to step forward was enormous. Broad as a barn door beard, braided with silver rings, hands like something forged rather than born. His name was Magnus. He removed his gloves carefully the way a man removes his hat when entering a church and stopped a few feet from Dorothy. We came for Dorothy Harlan. Cade nodded toward her. You found her. Magnus looked at Dorothy. Whatever speech he might have prepared collapsed under the weight of what he was actually seeing. The old woman, the burned land, the house still standing, the windmill still turning, the yard that had been a fire zone 3 days ago and was now covered in ash in the boot prints of 60 survivors. You saved our brothers, he said. Another rider stepped forward, carrying a crate of bottled water. Another had medical supplies. Another carried lumber with straps over one shoulder. Behind them, flatbeds rolled in loaded with fencing tools, generators, feed sacks, tarps, water tanks, propane canisters, chainsaws, boxes marked with handwritten labels. One trailer carried nothing but coolers. Another was stacked with plywood. A pickup behind the second line had a message painted on its rear window in white soap marker. For Dorothy. Dorothy looked from the supplies to the men to the valley still filling with the motorcycles. This is too much. Magnus shook his head. No, ma'am. Too much is what you did with one house buried water and no guarantee that anybody would remember. A younger biker with fresh road dust on his face swallowed hard before speaking. My cousin was in the bunker. Brennan, if not for you, he'd be dead before morning. A second voice rose from farther back. Jax, too. Then another, Vaughn. Then another, Kip. Names spread through the yard like embers in reverse, not burning, restoring. Men calling out the brothers who had come back alive. Men identifying the dead. Men making it public so that no one with a clipboard or a folder or a set of clean tires could ever shrink it into a line item. Dorothy held herself still through all of it, but her throat moved once when she swallowed. Just once. Then an older rider near the front of the crowd took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. He was Magnus's age or older, white-haired, weathered in a way that said he had been on roads before most of these men were born. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough authority of a man who did not waste words on things that didn't matter. My old man used to tell stories about a trucker on Balar Gap who pulled 2 patched riders out of an iced-over river one winter night. Said the man ruined his shoulder for life, dragging them clear. Said his wife was cut from the same steel. The yard went quiet. Cade looked at Dorothy because he knew that name mattered. Balar Gap. The bridge. Earl Harlan stopping his truck when every other driver kept going. The 2 riders he pulled from the water. The shoulder that never worked right again. The years of quiet gratitude that followed. Coffee. Fence repairs. Parts. The kind of loyalty that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. The old rider continued. When word came through about what happened on this ridge and your name was attached to it, nobody had to ask twice. That hit Dorothy harder than the noise had, harder than the sight of 1,000 motorcycles filling her valley, harder than anything Pratt or Loomis or any man with a folder had ever done to her. Because this was the thing she had never known. She had known Earl was remembered by the men he saved. She had known they came by for years after. She had known that time did what time always does, and the visits stopped and the clubs changed and the roads moved on. But she had not known the story survived. She had not known it was still being told, father to son, rider to rider, chapter to chapter, passed along through decades like a coin worn smooth by handling, but never spent. She had not known that Earl Harlan's name still meant something on roads she had never traveled, in rooms she had never entered, among men she had never met. She looked down for a moment, not in weakness, in the private act of measuring the distance between one winter night on Balar Gap and this afternoon in a burned yard full of strangers who were not strangers at all. Then she looked up again, and the yard was still full, and the valley was still rumbling, and the answer to every year she had spent alone on this ridge was standing in front of her wearing leather and road dust in the particular expression of men who had come to do something and would not be leaving until it was done. Magnus spoke again, this time louder, for the crowd. "We're not here for a visit." Dorothy raised her eyes. He gestured toward the line of bikes, trucks, trailers, and men that stretched from her yard to the highway and beyond. "We're here because nobody who saves 57 of ours gets left alone to stand in the ashes." The yard went still. Wind moved through. Ash drifted. The windmill turned one slow revolution. "What are all of you doing on my land?" Dorothy asked. Magnus stepped back, and the men behind him answered with motion. Trailers unlatched, ramps came down, chains rattled, pickup beds opened, lumber was unloaded in neat stacks, fencing rolls hit the dirt, water tanks were moved by 4 men at a time. Tool chests, generators, concrete mix, chainsaws, spare hoses, nails, gloves, plywood feed sacks, medical crates, blankets, propane heaters, portable pumps. Everything landed on Dorothy Harlan's burned property with the discipline of men who had not ridden hundreds of miles to make a scene. They had come to build one. "We're rebuilding it," Magnus said. A rider with a scarred face and a prosthetic left hand gave a rough grin. "Too many of us for half a job, ma'am." Within minutes, the property transformed. Not emotionally, physically. One crew stripped the last dangerous remnants of the burned porch corner and began shoring up the roof line with fresh lumber. Another set posts along the collapsed fence run. Another cleared debris from the yard and sorted it with worksite precision. Salvage, scrap, structural remains. 2 riders with medical training set up a treatment station under a tarp by the bunker and began rechecking burned smoke exposure and cracked ribs on the original survivors who had returned with the convoy. Because they had returned. Jax was there hauling boards. Kip was there working a post-hole bar into the scorched dirt. Brennan, one arm still wrapped, had somehow appointed himself keeper of the tool layout, barking at younger riders who buried hammers under nail crates. Finch ran water and checked on the firefighters who had come up from the hospital against medical advice because they were not going to let Dorothy face this part alone. Dalton, leg-wrapped and limping, refused to sit down. Sully finally shoved a coffee thermos into his hands. "Hold that. Be useful. Quiet." Vaughn had been ordered to stay on a cot under the treatment tarp. He kept trying to stand. "Point me at something small," he said. Sully pointed at the thermos. Vaughn took it from Dalton and held it with the careful grip of a man who understood that small jobs still mattered. Even Whelan, ribs bound and voice raw, sat propped against the bunker wall and watched. Holt, arm in a sling, spoke to anyone who would listen. Not loudly, steadily. He told the rescue crews what had happened in the ravine, told them what Dorothy had done, told them she had come back into the fire zone for county firefighters after the radio had already written the ridge off as dead. That part spread fast enough that by early afternoon, journalists started arriving. First a local camera crew, then a regional van, then a reporter from farther out who had heard the words "thousands of bikers" and come expecting spectacle, only to find a scorched ridge where hundreds of patched riders were rebuilding a widow's home in near total discipline, while surviving firefighters called her the reason they were alive. The cameras kept trying to find Dorothy. She kept stepping around them with a hammer, a coil of wire, or a bucket in her hands. A young reporter, with clean shoes and ash on her jacket, asked, "Mrs. Harlan, how does it feel to have become the center of this extraordinary show of support?" Dorothy set a box of nails on the porch rail and looked at her once. "It feels like work still needs doing." Then she walked away. That line made the evening broadcast. The county came back before sunset. This time they brought more than clipboards, 2 deputies, 2 county attorneys, Pratt again looking considerably less comfortable than before, Loomis, a woman from code enforcement, and 3 SUVs that stopped well below the property because the access road was packed with motorcycles, and the men standing beside those motorcycles were all looking uphill at the same time. The first row of riders did not approach the vehicles. They simply stood where they were, arms crossed, patches visible, faces still. That was worse than any confrontation. A living wall of leather and silence lined the lower edge of the ridge, while more men kept working above them, framing walls and setting posts, as if county vehicles were just another piece of weather not worth stopping for. Pratt got out anyway. He climbed halfway up the access road before Magnus stepped down to meet him. "State your business." Pratt straightened. "We're here on county authority regarding hazard mitigation review, pending access restrictions and enforcement of the temporary construction moratorium." Magnus glanced back at the property where men were installing fresh porch beams under camera lenses and firefighter witness. "Looks like access is fine." Pratt's jaw tightened. "We need to speak with Mrs. Harlan." From higher up the yard, Dorothy's voice carried down before anybody had to go fetch her. "You're speaking loud enough." She came down from the porch slowly, one hand dusty from work, the other holding her reading glasses and the unopened county packet from 4 days ago. Behind her walked Cade Sully Holt in his sling and Whelan in his rib brace, not bodyguards, witnesses. Pratt tried again. "Mrs. Harlan, this property remains under review. The temporary restriction order prohibits any structural activity. What's happening here may constitute a violation of county emergency authority." Dorothy held up the packet. This one, she opened it in front of him for the first time, leafed through the typed pages slowly enough for the cameras behind her to catch every motion. Then she tapped a paragraph with one blunt finger. "Hazard Mitigation Acquisition Authority, Emergency Condemnation Pathway, Redevelopment Suitability Review." She looked up. "You boys wrote all that fast." One of the county attorneys stepped forward. "Those are standard post-disaster procedural options, Mrs. Harlan." Whelan, ribs bound and breathing carefully, gave a painful laugh from behind Dorothy. "Funny how rescue took longer than paperwork." Several riders heard it and smiled without warmth. The attorney stiffened. "Sir, this is not the appropriate forum." Holt cut him off. He stepped forward with his arm in a sling and ash still caught in the seams of his boots, and he spoke not to the attorney but to the cameras. "I was on that ridge. So was Whelan. We were pinned past the ravine after County Command lost contact and declared the ridge non-survivable. Dorothy Harlan came back out into an active burn zone for us, after she'd already kept 58 civilians alive through a burnover that your own dispatchers called fatal." He let that settle. "That's the record you should be making." Cameras pivoted fast. Pratt's face changed, not guilt, calculation failing in public. Loomis tried to recover. "Regardless of the circumstances of the rescue, this location has presented long-standing infrastructural and safety concerns. The county has repeatedly proposed improvement options." Dorothy nodded once. "Road widening, utility cut, scenic access, easement pressure. 3 formal offers to buy low and call it planning." The reporter with the clean shoes looked up sharply. "You've been asked to sell before." 3 times formal, Dorothy said. "More if you count polite threats." That landed. The attorney started speaking at once, trying to compress the moment back into procedure, but too many people were listening now. Too many cameras, too many riders, too many men alive who should have been dead if Dorothy Harlan had behaved the way official systems expected lonely old women to behave. Cade stepped forward. He did not shout. That made it worse for the county. "We buried brothers on roads harder than this one. We know the difference between bad luck and a setup waiting for weakness. These papers showed up before this woman's porch cooled. That tells every man on this ridge exactly what it should." Magnus added from the line below, "And now it tells the cameras." Pratt looked openly rattled for the first time. His eyes moved from the firefighters to the reporters, to the rows and rows of motorcycles below, then back to Dorothy. "Mrs. Harlan, you're making this adversarial." Dorothy folded the county packet once, neatly, precisely, the way a woman folds something she intends to keep. "Son, you brought acquisition papers to a burned house before you brought respect. You made it adversarial." Silence followed, not empty, public, the kind that says something has shifted and everyone present can feel the new weight settling in real time. Then one of the county attorneys said the worst possible thing. "We can resolve this more quietly if necessary." A dozen cameras caught it. So did every rider on the ridge. Sully laughed once, a hard, broken sound. "Quietly," he said. "That one ought to go on a plaque." Reporters fired questions in every direction, about previous offers, about fire risk warnings that went unacted upon, about why the county had failed to maintain access routes to a known vulnerable ridge, about why hazard acquisition language had been drafted faster than rescue had been mounted, about the 3 prior purchase attempts, about the timeline, about the firefighters, about the radio call that had declared the ridge dead while 60 people were still breathing on it. Whelan answered that one. "Presumed deceased," they said, "while we were alive in a stone bunker that this woman built with her own hands because the county told her she was paranoid." The county stopped answering in full sentences. Pratt stopped meeting the cameras. Loomis kept trying to fold everything back into process language, but process sounds thin when living witnesses keep answering it with names, injuries, and specific timestamps. Jack spoke, then Brennan, then Kip, then Finch, whose hands shook slightly when he talked, but whose voice did not. Vaughn insisted on being helped to his feet beneath the treatment tarp. He stood with effort and pain, in the particular stubbornness of a man who had been told he would be left behind and had not been, and he said the only thing that mattered. "She told me nobody gets left on her property," and nobody did. The statement hit the crowd so cleanly that even the reporter stopped writing for a beat. Dorothy stood through all of it without trying to make herself larger than she was. An old woman in work boots, smoke in the lines of her face, hands marked by nails, dirt, and burns that were still healing. No speech prepared, no hunger for cameras, just a woman who had done what needed doing and had no intention of surrendering the ground where she had done it. By noon, the county reversed itself, not gracefully, not honestly enough to satisfy anyone watching, but publicly, which was the only currency that mattered now. Pratt announced that the condemnation review was suspended pending independent assessment. Hazard acquisition language was withdrawn. The temporary restriction order was lifted. Prior property actions would be re-examined by an outside review board. It was not justice in full, but it was retreat, and everyone on that ridge knew exactly why. Not because the county had found its conscience overnight, because too many people were watching, because the firefighters had spoken on the record, because the story had escaped the valley, because thousands of motorcycles lined the road like a living ledger of debt being returned with interest, and because one old woman had stood in front of cameras and clipboards and county attorneys and said the truest thing anyone had said in 4 days. "You brought acquisition papers before condolences." By late afternoon, the sharpest part was over. The riders went back to work. Porch railing went up. The barn wall was reinforced. Fence sections were set and wired. The bunker door was rehung on new hinges. Fresh water was lined up along the house in sealed containers. Somebody even righted one of the old rocking chairs and set it on the repaired section of porch like they were restoring something that had never been about furniture. When evening came, engines finally began starting again. Not all at once. One here, 3 there, then a rolling sequence down the valley as groups prepared to leave. Helmets went on, hands were shaken, supplies were left behind in organized rows. Men who looked like they belonged to motion stood still long enough to say goodbye properly. Some saluted her, some shook her hand with both of theirs. Some only nodded once because words would have made the moment smaller than it was. Rigby was one of the last to leave. The young rider with the scar through his eyebrow. The one who had whispered his daughter's name in a dark bunker while the mountain tried to burn through stone. He stopped at the edge of the porch and pulled out his phone, turned it toward Dorothy. On the screen was a photo of a little girl with a backpack bigger than her body standing in front of a yellow school bus squinting into the sun. That's Ellie, he said. Dorothy looked at the photo for a long time. Her face did not change in any way a camera would have caught. But something behind her eyes shifted. Something that recognized the distance between where Rigby stood and where his daughter stood and understood that the distance was not made of miles. It was made of choices. Go home to her, Dorothy said. Rigby nodded, pocketed the phone, got on his bike, and rode down the mountain without looking back because looking back would have cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. Magnus was the last of the visitors to leave. He took Dorothy's hand in both of his. His grip was careful, deliberate, the grip of a man who understood that some hands had done things that made them worth holding gently. You've got roads in every direction now, he said. Anything you need, anytime. You pick up a phone and somebody answers. Dorothy looked at him. Good, I may need parts. He laughed, a real laugh, the first sound on that property all week that didn't taste like smoke. Then he rode down the hill, and the valley began to empty, and the thunder of thousands softened into hundreds, then dozens, then the occasional fading line of chrome and sound disappearing down the black road toward wherever men like that go, when the work is finished and the debt is paid, and the road calls them back to the motion that is the only home some of them have ever trusted. Cade Mercer was the very last. He stood at the foot of the porch steps with his helmet in one hand. The borrowed truck was parked behind him. His hip was stiff. His eyes were still red. He looked like a man who had been through something that would take years to fully understand and who was not in any hurry to start understanding it because the woman in front of him deserved a proper goodbye first. You all right here? Dorothy sat in the rocking chair on the new boards. The metal box was on her lap. The photograph inside it faced upward, though the lid was closed. The evening light came through the smoke in long amber shafts that turned the black yard into something almost beautiful. The way damaged places sometimes look beautiful when the light catches them at the right angle and the person looking has earned the right to see it. She looked out over her land, scarred but hers, then toward the road where the last of the bikes were heading into the distance, growing smaller and quieter, but not gone, never quite gone. The sound of them would live in this valley for a long time, the way thunder lives in a canyon after the storm has passed. No, she said. Cade frowned slightly. Then Dorothy Harlan looked up at him, and there was something in her face that had not been there before. Not softness, not relief, something rarer than both. The expression of a woman who had carried a weight alone for so long that she had forgotten it was supposed to be shared, and who was only now in the last amber light of a day that had started with ash and ended with the sound of 1,000 engines, allowing herself to feel the difference. I'm not alone here, she said. Cade nodded once, like that was the only ending the story had ever been heading toward. Then he turned, walked to the truck, and drove down the mountain. Dorothy leaned back in the rocking chair. The porch creaked under her in the particular way that new wood creaks when it is still learning the shape of the person it was built for. The windmill turned behind the house, slower now, damaged but upright. The barn stood. The bunker stood. The land stretched out below her in every direction, black and scarred, and still hers. She rested one hand on the metal box. Inside it, a photograph of a young man who had stopped on a frozen bridge when no one else would, who had pulled strangers from icy water and ruined his shoulder and never once asked to be repaid, whose wife had taken that single act and built it into a life, into a cellar, into buried water drums, into the stubbornness to stay when everyone else left, into one night on a burning mountain when 58 men walked into the fire behind an old woman with a lantern because she was the only person left who knew the way. The evening settled. The road went quiet. The last light moved across the ridge and the yard and the chair and the woman sitting in it, and the mountain for the first time in days had nothing left to say. Dorothy watched the road a while longer, not waiting for the world to remember her, not waiting for anything at all, just sitting on her porch on her land, in the chair that someone had thought to set right, holding a box that held a life that had mattered, breathing air, that still tasted faintly of smoke, and would for a long time yet. And that was enough.